Hey everyone, welcome back to Toast and Topics.
Before we get started, we wanted to share that our first deliveries of Toast and Topics t-shirts are complete. To those of you who ordered, we hope that you are happy with the product, and we wanted to say thank you for your continued support of the show. Now, please go ahead and wear it proudly.
That's right, and for those of you who may still be interested in ordering one, please feel free to reach out to either Ben or myself via social media or email to express interest. If you fill out the t-shirt form that's linked in our bio, that works too.
That's right. So, in today's episode, we will continue on our policy theme in the lead up to this November's election with a focus on fiscal deficits. This is a topic that has been top of mind for many decades in the policy world, both in the US and elsewhere. And I think it's important that everyone, ourselves included, should care about it as it shapes the sustainability of government spending and our ability for the government to finance things that impact quite literally everyone.
Similar to our previous episode, we'll start by talking about the economic theory behind fiscal deficits and government budgets more broadly, and then try to understand how this actually works in practice through the lens of the US, especially why it's grown so much in recent years and what that might look like in the years ahead.
And before we start, as a disclaimer, we know that fiscal policy is often thought of as being among the most boring topics to discuss or listen to, but we promise we'll try to keep it as interesting and relevant as possible. So, Sachin, with that said, do you want to start us off here by answering in simple terms what a fiscal deficit even is?
Yes, absolutely. So, a fiscal deficit quite simply occurs when a government's total expenditures exceed its total revenues. It essentially represents a shortfall between what the government spends and what it collects in taxes, fees, and other income sources. The government budget can be thought of in economic terms as, quote, G less T, or in other words, total government spending less taxes. One of the primary ways that a government raises money is via taxes, and any government spending in excess of its tax revenue has to be financed by borrowing, which puts the government into some form of debt, and we call that a deficit. The government spends on a lot of things, including infrastructure, defense, and welfare programs, to name a few. In fact, in fiscal year 2024 thus far, the US federal government has spent an estimated $6.29 trillion dollars on a variety of programs that support the American public. And the fiscal deficit is currently estimated at $1.9 trillion dollars, which is over 6% of US GDP.
That's a massive number, Sachin. And so, how exactly does the government borrow that much money in practice?
To pay for a deficit, the federal government borrows money by selling treasury bonds. And the national debt is effectively the accumulation of this borrowing, along with associated interest payments that the government would owe to the investors who purchased these bonds in the first place. The US Treasury itself is responsible for managing the government's budget, and it's important to differentiate here between the Treasury and the Fed, which often get somewhat confused. Um, these are two separate institutions with two very different purposes. While the Treasury collects the government's tax revenues, distributes its budget, issues bonds to raise financing, and quite literally prints the money that we use, the Fed, on the other hand, focuses on a specific dual mandate of maintaining stable prices and maximum employment. Now, where things may get confusing is that the Fed also buys US Treasuries. In fact, in 2022, it was estimated that the Fed paid the Treasury roughly $76 billion dollars, and this number was well over $500 billion dollars over the span of a few months during the COVID-19 pandemic stimulus. And this is a huge channel through which the Fed controls the supply of money in the economy, which ultimately affects interest rates and price levels.
That makes sense. And the point you made on the independence of these two bodies is something that we've talked a lot about, for example, back at economics courses at Dartmouth. It's very important for the Fed and the Treasury to be independent of each other. Monetary policy independence is crucial because it prevents a country's central bank from financing reckless government spending, and it ensures that monetary policy decisions are based on economic fundamentals, whatever the mandate of the Fed is, rather than fiscal spending, which is much more sensitive to a specific politician's agendas and also to election cycles. It's important to emphasize here that the Fed's mandate is not to finance government spending.
Yeah, and that's a good segue to start talking a bit more about the US, which has had a growing national debt that's reaching new highs this year. And just some stats to set the scene here. At the start of 1992, America's net debt amounted to 46% of GDP. Today, that number has reached a staggering 96% of GDP. And deficits are nothing new to us. In fact, since 2001, the federal government's budget has run a deficit each year with increases in spending and interest on debt outpacing the growth of federal revenue. But what's interesting in all this is that it's really not an issue that's been at the top of voters' minds, which is at the polar opposite of what it was back in the 1990s when it was at the center of most political campaigns. So, Ben, could you walk us through the growth in the US fiscal deficit over the years and help me and our audience understand how we even got here?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start here by looking at this from a global perspective. Data from the International Monetary Fund this April shows that America had the eighth highest net public debt to GDP ratio in the world. That means the value of our total debt relative to GDP. Some other advanced economies do sit above America. Japan, for example, is ranked second with a share of debt to GDP that's 158%. Italy is third at 129%. But America's figures can be thought of as being concerning because of number one, the pace of debt accumulation, which has been quite high, and number two, the centrality of the US to the global economy. Even though the US doesn't have the highest share of debt to GDP in the world, its economy is so big that it does have the largest level of public debt in the world in absolute terms. And the IMF forecasts that by the end of 2024, the US fiscal deficit will be 6.5% of GDP. Among other advanced economies, only Israel is going to be borrowing more. And of course, Israel is currently at war. Just in general, the US has run fairly high fiscal deficits over the past 8 or so years. For reference, under Presidents Trump and Biden, the federal deficit averaged 4.5% of GDP a year, and that is excluding the pandemic years of 2020 and 2021. In fact, our borrowing is so vast that credit agencies, including both S&P and Fitch, have downgraded America's debt, and Moody's has been threatening to do so.
Wow. So, what is the actual driver of that increase in debt that we've seen here?
Well, as mentioned before, at least in the short term, the COVID-19 pandemic resulted in a massive increase in the fiscal deficit for 2020 and 2021. And the reasons there are straightforward. The government undertook unprecedented measures to stimulate the economy, for example, offering stimulus checks to many Americans, and that increased government spending. More than that, because many people were out of work during the pandemic, tax revenues decreased because people weren't making as much income. But there are other structural drivers of the debt as well that are going to be very important over the next several decades. And to think about those, it's important to note that the federal government can be split into two categories with respect to its spending. There's a discretionary component and a mandatory component. The discretionary part of the federal budget is what our Congress actually has control over, and that determines allocations for things such as defense spending and education, to name just a couple of examples. Mandatory spending, on the other hand, is money that we are obligated to spend every year on programs such as Medicare and Social Security, to name a couple examples. When you break out the federal budget in 2022, around 26% of it went to discretionary programs. Another 65% of federal spending went to mandatory programs, including 19% to Social Security, and 12% to Medicare. The crucial point here is that spending on these mandatory programs is projected to increase. Over the next 10 years, for example, we're going to see most of the baby boomers retiring, and that will increase spending on Social Security. More than that, spending is forecast to increase pretty significantly on almost all healthcare related programs. So, however high our deficit has been in recent years, there are some pretty substantial structural forces that could push the deficit higher unless some kind of intervention is undertaken.
That's really interesting, Ben. And I know we've talked a lot about aging populations across different regions in Toast and Topics. And one thing that you didn't mention that I found pretty interesting as well is that our deficit has been exacerbated by the high interest rates that we've seen over the past 2 to 3 years. In 2022 alone, interest payments accounted for 8% of total federal spending. In the 2 decades before COVID, interest payments actually accounted for about a third of the federal deficit every year. And over the next 2 decades, estimates from the Congressional Budget Office suggest that interest payments will make up two-thirds of the deficit every year. For fiscal year 2024, interest payments are estimated to total $892 billion for the full year. And over the next decade, this is expected to total $12.9 trillion dollars. Just think about that. That's only interest. Um, by that projection, forecasts suggest that America's debt to GDP ratio will rise from the current 96% to about 166% over the next 30 years by the time that you and I are probably going to be retired.
Oh boy. Well, Japan's net debt, for example, is already around that 160% level, and it has had no trouble issuing new bonds to finance its debts. But, I think the key difference here is that Japan has been able to stay on top of its interest obligations thanks to extremely low interest rates. And notably, it's had a hard time raising interest rates for that exact reason. Its debts are so large that even a small increase in interest rates could make its interest payments somewhat difficult to finance. So I've read that America's public interest costs are already roughly double Japan's as a share of GDP. That's I guess, somewhat alarming. And then to stabilize the U.S. debt to GDP ratio by 2029, the IMF reckons that the U.S. will need to trim its primary deficit by about 4% of GDP. So it does seem that, there is some concern about how America will be able to stay on top of these obligations in the long term.
Yeah, that's pretty substantial. So I guess my question in all of this is, should we be concerned? How do we know if a fiscal deficit is sustainable in the first place?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I think that there are a few factors that we need to break down here to just get a better handle on it. Um, One way of thinking about whether our fiscal deficits are sustainable is in terms of GDP growth. Basically, if the nominal growth rate of the economy, which is essentially the government's tax base, is greater than the interest rate, so the cost of servicing government debts, um, really the government can stay on top of its debt obligations pretty effectively. Between 2008 and 2019, for example, when interest rates fell to nearly zero, the economy's rate of growth was higher than the interest rate, and that meant that debt servicing costs as a share of government revenue trended down to about half of what they were in 1990. Put simply, even as the government borrowed more, debt as a share of GDP remained stable. And so, if our growth rates continue to outpace the interest rates in the economy, our debt obligations actually may be somewhat manageable. Inflation is another important consideration to have when looking at the national debt. High inflation in 2021 and then really through 2023 meant that prices and incomes grew quickly, which pushed up America's nominal economic output. And meanwhile, the amount of debt that it owed rose more slowly in dollar terms, and therefore debt actually shrank relative to GDP in those years. But with inflation now back under control, politicians can really no longer rely on rising prices to shrink the debt to GDP ratio. A structural consideration that I think also makes America's debt a bit less concerning is the currency in which it's denominated. Um, as you mentioned, Sachin, the US government influences and finances spending in excess of taxes by issuing bonds. And these bonds are denominated in US dollars. And that's actually very important because it means that if the value of the dollar changes relative to that of other currencies, meaning if the dollar depreciates or appreciates, the value of America's debt won't change for Americans. We'll still owe the same number of dollars to pay for it. And that same thing can't be said of many other countries, which often issue their debts in foreign currencies. And so if the value of their currencies change, they actually might have to pay more in their own currency to meet their debt obligations. So the fact that we're issuing debt in dollars is actually something that really works to our advantage. Finally, you have to think about the appeal of US treasuries. I think that we've been able to get away with running such large fiscal deficits in part because US treasuries are perceived as being a asset that can generate a pretty high level of safe returns for investors. And so people buy treasuries whenever we issue them, and we've been able to stay on top of our debts just for that reason and that reason alone. Still, there are plenty of reasons that the US might want to constrain its fiscal deficit, but doing so would require some potentially painful fiscal discipline, either by raising taxes or curbing discretionary spending or altering requirements for mandatory spending programs like Social Security. And none of those options really seem to be politically appealing, and the debt has not gotten to a point at which we can't seem to finance it. So politicians don't appear willing to make these kinds of sacrifices. I think that the nearest term risk to our ability to deal with the deficit is political more than anything else. Listeners might recall that there's been a lot of discussion about the US defaulting on its debt over the past year due to a legislative curb on government spending known as the debt ceiling. And this is a limit on the maximum amount of debt the federal government can incur. Congress routinely raises this ceiling to allow the federal government to continue borrowing, but in recent years, this has become a more contentious point. For example, when the debt ceiling was set to expire in 2013, the debate over that limit forced the government into a shutdown. In 2021, that issue again really did come down to the wire. And in 2023, President Biden and senior Republicans in the House of Representatives again reached a deal to raise the debt ceiling really only days before the Treasury Department said that it would run out of money. And so if the debt ceiling weren't to be raised, that could actually result in the federal government defaulting on its debts simply because it would no longer be allowed to borrow.
Well, thanks for that, Ben. That would be something that could have some pretty catastrophic implications. So, I could think of many things. It could jeopardize our ability to meet necessary payments on programs such as Social Security and Medicare. It would probably result in holders of treasuries not receiving interest payments, and that could make people less willing to hold US government debt in the future, which could ultimately diminish the appeal of US debt more broadly.
Yeah, hopefully it doesn't come to that, but I think that this is a political question right now, much more than it is an economic one. So to sum up here, I think that regardless of, who wins the US presidential election in November, the next 4 or 5 years are likely to make a bad fiscal situation even worse. Cuts in spending to bring down the debt, as I already mentioned, would be painful. We have a lot of baby boomers retiring, though not those who work in Congress. And generally, an aging population is going to require more government services, which could push up spending. And high levels of defense spending and a transition to renewable energy via industrial policy very well could also add to that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that's right, but it's also important to acknowledge that a lot of these are necessary things to spend on, and it's not necessarily in our control how this grows. So we'll see how this goes. But I think it's fair to say that our fiscal future is looking pretty expensive, to say the least. So, on that happy note, join us next week on Toast and Topics, where we will discuss the state of antitrust regulation in the US and, in particular, the recent crackdowns on some large tech mergers. We'll see you then.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Toast and Topics. Before signing off, we wanted to disclose that the views expressed in this podcast are not representative of the organizations that we are associated with. If you learned something in this episode, please share it with a friend or leave us a review. Until next time.